Welcome back to another episode of Dazed and Apologized, the podcast where we help you navigate culture's questions with faith and reason. Today, we're going to take up a question that is actually pretty easy to answer in and of itself. And so the bulk of our time today is going to be discussed or used to discuss how do we engage with someone that has this objection or has this question. And here's the question. Isn't Christianity responsible for so many evils in the world? Or haven't Christians committed so many evils in this world? And the objection here is typically, if Christians have done that or are responsible for that or believed something that led them to do that, then I want nothing to do with Christianity. That's typically how the objection is posed. Now, before we get into it, I want to just mention two resources that I'm highly indebted to, really for the whole podcast, but particularly for this episode. The first one is a book called Confronting Christianity by Rebecca McLaughlin. And the subtitle is 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. She deals with a lot of the questions that we've been dealing with in this podcast. One of her whole chapters specifically deals with this issue. Isn't Christianity bad for the world? Isn't it responsible for so many evils? And then the second book is How Christianity Has Changed the World by Alvin Schmidt. And this book is heavily researched, and he just goes into the amazing and overwhelmingly positive influence that Christianity has had on the world. He talks about schools and orphanages and hospitals and the influence of Christianity on the arts and culture. Tremendous book that will be helpful. So I'm going to quote from these and lean on these heavily during this podcast. Now, the first thing we have to understand when dealing with this issue is that you have to say yes. Christianity has a dark side. There is a bloody history to Christianity. There's no way around that. So-called believers, and I say so-called, we'll get to that in a minute, but people who have professed to believe in Jesus, profess to be Christians, have committed evils, have done really bad things, all the way from, thousands of years ago in history, even to now, pastors that embezzle money and do really, really bad things. I mean, people who claim to be Christians have done bad things. I think you can't hide from that. There's no way around that. And most people, when they start this conversation, who have this objection, they start with the Crusades. Now, the Crusades happened over 1,000 years ago, from the years 1096 to 1291. And what people typically say is just what I said. If Christians can do that, I want nothing to do with Christianity. Now, if you're not familiar with the Crusades, I won't go into the history of it, but it was a bloody series of wars between Christians and Muslims, and they were fighting over possession of or ownership of holy lands and holy sites, holy places. Now, excuse me, what's interesting here, and I'm indebted to McLaughlin here for this, she helps us to see that modern research has actually shown that the typical way that we've been taught about the Crusades is that Christians were unprovoked, and they just attacked these peacekeeping, peace-loving Eastern Muslims, and it was all 100% the Christians that were just angry and attacked them. That's kind of how you've been taught. Maybe you've heard the Crusades being mentioned like that. It's actually not the truth. In fact, it's the opposite, according to modern research. This is a quote from her book. The Crusades were, in historian Robert Louis Wilkins' words, quote, a Christian counter-offensive against the occupation of lands that had been Christian for centuries before the arrival of Islam. So in reality, the Christians were fighting to regain control of these lands that were previously theirs. Now that doesn't justify, I'm not trying to justify the massive amounts of bloodshed. It was still a stain on Christian history, but it does explain the motivation and the reason behind the Crusades, which is helpful when you're understanding history and particularly the subject we're talking about today. But there's more than just the Crusades that people point to that have this objection. They point to, of course, slavery in the Americas in the early 1800s and mid-1800s. They talk about how Christian pastors would use the Bible to defend, owning another human being, to defend the fact that certain human beings were of lesser value than other human beings. Is just awful hermeneutics, awful understanding of biblical Christianity. Some people that have this objection will point to how some German pastors during World War II. They defended Hitler and what he was doing in the Jewish genocide. And you could go on and on and on, but they point to these moments in history where Christians have been on the wrong side of history, and they've used the Bible to defend some bad things. And so we have to admit that those things are true. They're documented, and it's not going to help to rewrite history or to try to pretend these things doesn't happen. So the question for today is, what do we do with it? How do we talk to people about this? So I think the first thing we have to understand that's helpful is when you're engaging someone in a conversation about this, make sure that they're not committing logical fallacies in their thinking or in their line of reasoning. So just a couple that are easy to make when you're talking about Christians and doing bad things in history. First is the hasty generalization fallacy. And that's simply when someone draws expansive conclusions about something based on inadequate or insufficient evidence. So yes, there's evidence that supports that Christians have done bad things, but it's a hasty generalization to say that all Christians are bad and that all Christians have done bad things. To kind of paint it with a wide brush and say, well, if that group of Christians did it, those bad Christians, then all Christians are like that. No, that's not logically fair. Another fallacy would be, I love the name, the slothful induction fallacy, which is just hilarious, by the way. But this is the exact opposite of the hasty generalization fallacy. Slothful induction simply means in the face of logical evidence, you still don't believe it. You say, okay, I see this evidence out there, but I'm going to reject that and I'm going to believe something. You fail to acknowledge what the evidence supports. And so the reason I say be careful with that is because there's overwhelming evidence that supports that Christianity has been good for society, that Christianity has brought tremendous benefit to people groups, to society, to culture, to just people in general. And so in the face of that overwhelming evidence, you could say, no, still, in light of all that, I still think Christians are bad and they're responsible for so much bad. So that's where I'm indebted to this book, How Christianity Changed the World. So I want to just read a couple things from this book because I think it's really important. First, just in the table of contents, you can see that he talks about how the sanctity of human life, sexual morality, women. We've already had a whole podcast about does the Bible denigrate women? No, it doesn't. And he has tremendous research to prove that Christianity brought freedom and dignity to women. He talks about orphanages. He talks about hospitals and healthcare. He talks about Christianity's imprint on education, labor laws and economic freedom, science, abolition of slavery, art and architecture, music, literature, holidays. I mean, just tremendous impact that Christians have had throughout history. And then in the foreword to the book, Paul Meyer wrote the foreword. He's a professor of ancient history. He talks about apologetics and how there's various ways you can defend the Christian faith. But he says this in the introduction. He said, Professor Schmidt's brilliant study has convinced me that the faith, the Christian faith, can also be splendidly defended on another front. It's a record of being the most powerful agent in transforming society for the better across the 2,000 years since Jesus lived on the earth. And then he says this, no other religion, philosophy, teaching, nation, movement, or whatever has so changed the world for the better as Christianity has done. And so the slothful induction fallacy says in the face of all that overwhelming evidence, you still go, no, I don't believe it. You have to help them see that that's actually a logical fallacy. And then the third thing would be the fallacy of composition. And this is very similar to hasty generalization. It's where you infer something to be true of the whole because a part of that whole does something. So a small part of something can be true of a group of people, and then you say, well, that's true of the whole. That's not fair. It would be like, if a group of middle-aged women all wearing red shirts came parading through my neighborhood and completely trashed it. Just completely trashed it. They overturned trash cans, they broke windows, they broke mailboxes, they punctured tires, they just completely they burn trees or whatever. They just completely trash the neighborhood, right? And then, a couple weeks later, I'm at Walmart and I see a middle-aged woman in a red shirt, and I called the police and I'm like, you need to arrest that lady. She's bad. Well, that's not fair, right? Because that lady, just because she happens to be middle-aged and happens to be wearing a red shirt, does not mean she had any knowledge or anything to do, does not bear any responsibility for what happened in my neighborhood. It's kind of that same idea. You need to help them understand that they must be fair and they must be logically consistent. Okay, the second thing, so the first thing to do is help them see these logical fallacies that they're probably unknowingly thinking about when they say, well, isn't Christianity responsible for so much bad? The second thing to do is to take them back to the original teachings of Jesus. This is super important because you forget what other people say. Forget what pastors have said. Forget what books have been written. Go back to the source, okay? And help them to see, what did Jesus actually teach about violence? What did he actually teach? What does the Bible actually say about these things? And if you do that with them, you help them to see that Jesus, you take them to verses like Matthew 5:39. Jesus says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, this is what he said to his disciples. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, you turn the other cheek to them, right? So don't fight back with them, right? Show them love and grace and mercy. Matthew 5:44, Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Luke 23:34, as Jesus is being nailed to the cross, he prayed for the forgiveness of those who were committing that evil, right? And there's other, so just help them to see that Jesus' teachings here completely contradict the actions of these people in human history. What they did does not jive with what biblical Christianity is. It's not biblical Christianity. And so you can condemn those acts as well. Condemn the pastors in the 1800s who defended slavery. Condemn the bloodthirsty Christians who fought and, killed women and children. Say, yes, that's not okay. I don't agree with that. Those acts did not agree, or they do not align with the biblical teaching, with Jesus' teaching. So that's really important. Go back to the source. Go back to the original thing and agree with them. That stuff is heinous. Jesus would not be proud of them. He would not have liked what they did. So, third thing, and this is really important, and again, I'm indebted to these books here. The third thing you need to do is help folks understand that people doing bad things in the world is not a Christian problem. It's not a strictly problem that Christians have done. In fact, every other major religion has a bloody and dark history. So take Islam, for example. I'm just going to briefly walk through some of these things. A central tenet of Islam is the jihad, which literally means to struggle. So Muslims believe that they are fighting the enemies of Islam and they're defending the Islamic communities from its oppressors and from its enemies. And the jihad has been central to many wars. The Afghan Mujahideen, the Taliban, the Northern Alliance, they've waged the jihad in Afghanistan against the foreign powers. Muslims in Kashmir, Chechnya, Dagestan, the southern Philippines, Bosnia, and Kosovo have all struggled and fought in the name of jihad. Even Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Palestine, they've characterized their war with Islam as a jihad. Algeria's armed Islamic group has engaged in jihad. Even Al-Qaeda has waged war, the global jihad against Muslim governments and the West. So to fight, to struggle is a central theme of Islam, and you see that throughout history. Buddhism. How about Buddhism? We all look at Buddhism as this peaceful religion where people just sit and meditate and do yoga. Well, it also has a bloody past. Now, I'm going to read at length from McLaughlin's book here. I've got it written in my iPad. A 2018 New York Times op-ed entitled, "Why Are We Surprised When Buddhists Are Violent?" reminded us that there is no shortage of historical examples of violence in Buddhist societies. The article cites Sri Lanka's civil war from 1983 to 2009, which was fueled by specifically Buddhist nationalism. violence in modern Thailand, violence within the Dalai Lama's own sect, and a growing body of scholarly literature on the martial complicity of Buddhist institutions in World War II, like Japanese nationalism. Her point is not, she says, the point is not that Buddhism is particularly violence-inducing. Millions of Buddhists lead peaceful lives. But if we think of Buddhism as a religion free of blood, we deceive ourselves. And we overlook Buddhist-perpetrated violence, particularly targeted against Muslims. And then she even talks about the persecution of Christians at the hands of the Shinto Buddhist government in 17th century Japan. Tens of thousands of Christians were murdered and executed in atrocious ways. So again, even Buddhism, something that we would think that would be particularly peaceful, has a bloody and dark past. And I won't go on and on, but she concludes this by saying, quote, "In an analysis of violent history, no major world religion emerges without blood on its hands." So it's not a particularly Christian problem, right? Other religions have bloody past and have adherents to those religions have done awful things in the name of their religion. Now, just in case you're watching or listening to this and thinking, oh, so religion must be the problem. If it's not specifically Christianity, but Islam has a bloody past, Buddhism has a bloody past, Hinduism, all this, so it must be a religious problem. Well, no. We need to not understand that as well, because atheistic regimes and atheistic societies and countries also have a bloody history and a bloody past. Take China, for example. Now, Marxism and communism kind of go together with atheism. We're not going to get into too much detail there, but Marxism, according to the basic definitions found on most websites, says that Marxism is a social, political, and economic philosophy named after 19th century German philosopher Karl Marx. And what his works, belief, and thought did was they examined capitalism and labor, productivity, economies, and they argued that a worker revolution is needed to kind of replace capitalism with a communist government. And so Marxism kind of pits the social classes, the educated against the labor force. And they create chaos, and they want the labor people, the poor worker people, to rise up against the educated, the bourgeois, if you will. And you see this play out in the Soviet Union, in China, and lesser communist countries like North Korea and Cuba and Vietnam. But going back to China, in 2016, Xi Jinping, the president of China, said this, that the members of the Communist Party must act as, quote, unyielding Marxist atheists. So he's being open with what they believe. And atheism is in there. So you can't tie this to you can't tie this to a religion. And so I happen to know a lot about Chinese history. The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 estimatedly killed anywhere from 1.2 million to 20 million people. Now, that's such a wide range because no historian really knows the number, because the government did such a good job of covering it up, of not letting the press in, not letting other people in. But there's been a slew of books written about it, and eyewitness accounts say that these rivers that were miles wide were filled with bodies, so much so that the water, that the bodies were above the surface of the water. That's how many bodies just in one city. And so even now, the Chinese government is committing what the U.S. government has labeled a genocide against the Uyghur people of China. The Uyghurs are a group of Chinese Muslims that live in the northwest part of China. And the Chinese government has labeled them a terrorist group. And so they are putting them in concentration camps. They're forced abortion, forced sterilization for their women, forced labor camps. It's very similar to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And all of this is being done in the absence of religion. They claim there is no God. They don't claim any belief in God, and yet they're doing some horrendous things to fellow human beings. So that's just one example. I won't go into other countries, but we all know the Soviet Union, other countries that are atheistic regimes have done terrible things to people. So you can't pin violence and bloodshed on religion. Okay, so if it's not a particularly Christian problem, and it's not a particularly religious problem, then what is it? Well, here's where I hope and pray that if you're having conversations with people, you'll be able to get them to this. So walk them through all those things that I said, help them to see it's not a Christian problem, it's not a religious problem, it's a human problem. It's a humankind, it's a mankind problem. And this is a fundamental tenet of Christianity. We believe that all people are born with a sinful nature. And if you don't believe this, then I just encourage you to hang around kids for just a few minutes. And you'll see that self-preservation and self-preservation at all cost is something that is innate and that is in every child in the world. They quickly learn that if I lie, I won't get in trouble. If I blame someone else and they get the punishment, then I don't get the punishment. Sin is the problem. We believe in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so what's really neat here is that you admit, when you're talking to people, you admit the bloody history of the world, of Christians, of religious people, of non-religious people. You can admit it. You can say, yes, these things happen. You can condemn them because they don't align with biblical teachings. But then you take them back to the heart of the problem, and that's sin. That sin causes us to do things that we would never otherwise do. And sin does not discriminate in the sense of even Christians struggle with sin. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you don't struggle with sin. We all struggle fighting the sin in our lives on a daily basis. Now, we do hold Christians to a bit of a higher standard in the sense that we ought to be growing in godliness. We ought to be growing in holiness. We ought to be living a life that pleases God, but we can't escape this. We can't escape the fact that Satan is in this world and his demons are in this world. They're spiritual forces of darkness that are still pressing in upon us every day. And so get to this point with your friend that you're talking to. Get to this point. All human beings are sinners. All human beings have a sin problem, and all human beings need a Savior. And the evidence of evil in the world supports that. And it cannot be tied to a particular person, to a particular group. It's tied to humans. And so use this as an opportunity, again, to share the gospel with them. Point them to the Savior, Jesus, that came to redeem them, to forgive them of that sin, so that they can live a life of gratitude to God as a believer. And so I hope that you can see how to navigate these conversations. This is a tough one because, like I said, you have to concede, you have to admit. But I hope that this podcast has been helpful for you to see how you can take what's happened in the world. You can take the facts of human history, but you can point them to the cross. Point them to what Jesus did on the cross. So I'm praying for you, and I hope that this has been helpful as you have these conversations. God bless, and be sure to tune in next time.